Time for Inside the Sixers as they take on the Atlanta Hawks tonight, Game 3. The coverage begins at 7:30. Tom McGinnis has the call, but something tells me the tip-off probably won't start until somewhere around 8 o'clock. That's the way they kind of do these things. By the way, they have announced that Game 5 in Philly will be at 8:30 on Wednesday night. I do not know what time the game on Monday would be. That would be nice for my traffic department, but I digress. Let's bring Paul Hudrick in from 97.3 ESPN.com. Maybe he knows what time Game 4 will be on Monday night. Do you have any clue?
I don't. I would imagine 7:30.
Now, why do they have the Game 5 out and not the Game 4?
Well, I want to point out, so I believe Game 4, that 8:30 start is only if Utah sweeps the Clippers. If there is a Game 5 for that series, the Sixers would be at 7:30. So go Clippers.
Okay, all right. So because that game would be in Philly at 8:30.
Yes,
yeah,
correct.
Game 5 Wednesday night. Now I saw somebody from the Sixers, Laura Rosen, tweet today the game was 8:30, but I guess she didn't put a little asterisk.
She did. She actually had a caveat. She did comment on that and said that it was contingent on Clippers and Jazz.
I said, what's the biggest surprise in this series to you so far? I'll give you my answer. Let me hear what yours is.
Biggest surprise. I mean, part of me wants to say Joel Embiid kind of doing this all on one leg, because that's pretty crazy to me. But at the same time, nothing really surprises me with him. I guess I'm a little surprised in the way that Doc has used his bench. I mean, I probably shouldn't be, but I'm a little surprised he hasn't shortened it to just 9 guys. I guess in a weird way, he's kind of done that because of the way he's implemented things, but I'm surprised that he's still allowing all 11 guys to play. I thought he would have tightened things up a little bit at this point, especially after they lost Game 1. And I guess the fact that they lost Game 1, quite frankly, I really thought they'd be up 2-0 going into Atlanta. So I am also pretty surprised that they're down, that they're tied 1-1. And as you can see, basically since that first quarter where Atlanta punched them in the mouth in Game 1, they've been the better team really in every quarter since.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The fact that he hasn't shortened it. I guess that is somewhat of a surprise that I didn't kind of go down that path. For me, Paul, I know the Hawks played at Madison Square Garden, but the Knicks aren't that good. Let's be honest; it's just not a talented team. They were scrappy and a nice bunch. But the fact that this moment doesn't seem too big for a team that really doesn't have a lot of playoff experience, that's the biggest surprise to me. And now they're going home. I'm really intrigued to see if they bring it up another level.
Yeah, when you look at certain guys, Bogdanovich is a guy who's played in a ton of big games overseas. He hasn't played in them here, but he's played a ton in overseas. Gallinari's played in a ton of big games. Lou Williams. They have guys that have been around. Even Capella. When Capella was in Houston, he played in some pretty big games. So, maybe a guy like Trae Young or a guy like John Collins doesn't have that kind of playoff resume, but there are guys on this roster that do, and I think that's part of it. And then another part of it is credit to Trae Young, when he just has that personality to him, where really it doesn't seem like it. Not only does it not seem like it bothers him, it seems like he almost enjoys it. You talked about him playing at Madison Square Garden; he loves that villain role. And if I were Sixers fans, I would just quit that Trae as balding champ because, one, I think it's sort of lame, and two, I think he feeds it. I think it feeds him. I think he loves it. So it's partially, I think, a mix of their veterans having that influence, and then a young guy like Trae who just has that bravado and that confidence to him. I don't think this moment phases him in one bit.
Yeah, you mentioned, you're right, Lou Williams, but a lot of those guys have played in moments overseas, as you kind of hinted at, but they're younger players who they rely on. John Collins is one of their better players, and of course Trae Young. It just seems that that is the interesting part about this series. It's like we're almost waiting to see if Atlanta kind of wilts here, and I didn't feel that they were going to in either of the 2 games of Philly, which kind of says to our listeners, you shouldn't expect them to kind of fold when they go back home. They should only play better. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times, Paul, the Hawks needed to hit 23s to beat the Sixers. They shot in Game 2 about what their average is from 3. They cannot be average, right? They've got to be better than their average to beat this team. So do you anticipate them, when we talk about making the adjustments, finding more ways to get more threes up? They took like 20 less threes in Game 2 than they did in Game 3.
Yeah, and like the one adjustment that I wouldn't be surprised if it comes, I don't know if it's necessarily a Game 3 adjustment, but you might want to consider putting Kevin Huerter in a starting lineup and either not playing Solomon Hill at all or bringing him off the bench, because Kevin Huerter through 2 games has been outstanding. Now, to your point, is the other shoe going to drop on him, because he's something like 15 of 19, which he's not Wilt Chamberlain. So at some point, there's going to be a little bit of regression there. And I guess the other thing is too, they had to do something to get John Collins going. I mean, he's a really good player. He's been a really good player for them. He's a guy looking for a big payday, and he kind of, the first 2 games, quite frankly, he's been pretty invisible. So I think that's one of the big things. I think they need to find some way to get Collins going, whether that's maybe going small. I mean, that could be one adjustment I can see them making, is when Doc Rivers goes to Dwight Howard, play small and put John Collins as your 5, run Trae Young and John Collins pick and rolls and force Dwight Howard into some tough situations. Now, the Sixers have a good counter in that they could just put Ben Simmons at the 5, and that can mitigate a lot of that. But I think that's one way McMillan can kind of force Doc Rivers' hand into doing some things maybe he doesn't want to do. So I think those are the couple of the big things. Just lineup stuff, I think they could definitely make some adjustments. But yeah, I clearly optimizing 3-point shots is huge. And it's what they've, yes, game 2 is more their average, but they are capable of what they did in game 1. If Trae Young is getting to where he wants on the floor and is finding those guys on the perimeter, and like we just talked about at the top, those guys aren't blinking. Those guys are not afraid of those moments.
Now, I want to take it back to the Sixers-Raptors series a couple of years ago, right? So everybody's going crazy that Nick Nurse did this and Brett Brown, and then Brett Brown made the adjustment. He put Embiid on Pascal Siakam, and that really turned that series around. It really changed that series. And then Nurse made an adjustment that the Sixers couldn't adjust to because they had no other size. It was like Greg Monroe, and that really was the difference, is Nurse had an extra adjustment. I guess the question would be is, the Hawks did what they did. The Sixers made the adjustment. Do the Hawks have the Nick Nurse move to make an adjustment to that adjustment? Or is that adjustment going to be, like if the Raptors couldn't adjust to Joel Embiid defending Pascal Siakam, they might have won that series. They had the personnel to do it. Do the Hawks have the personnel to make the adjustment to the Sixers adjustment? Did you follow all that?
Try.
Did you follow that?
I did. They're going to try. As far as Joel Embiid goes, I don't know what they can do. Clint Capella is a pretty darn good center, a very good defensive basketball player, and Joel Embiid is having his way one-on-one against him every time he gets the basketball. Their double teams have not been very good. They've shown nothing exotic. They're not really blitzing it. And I also, quite frankly, don't think they necessarily have the defensive horses that a Nick Nurse had 2 years ago to be able to do that at a high level. If we're talking Trae Young and Ben Simmons guarding him and T. Stiebel guarding him, yeah, they're going to try some different things. They're probably going to try to run some different actions. They're going to try to get Trae in the middle of the floor, get him into the paint where he can facilitate. One of the things that could help, again, is going to a guy like Huerter, maybe either in the starting lineup or earlier in the game, because then that's one guy, when you put Solomon Hill in the game, the Sixers are thinking, okay, Solomon Hill, shoot your heart out. Like, you know what I mean? With Kevin Huerter, you can't really do that. I mean, granted, you prefer Kevin Huerter taking shots as opposed to Trae Young taking shots and wreaking havoc. But if you're the Hawks, you'd much prefer the ball in Huerter's hands than Solomon Hill. So that could be one big adjustment I could definitely see. And the Sixers, depending on how that goes, the Sixers might have to do some adjustments off of that. And then again, as I mentioned, with the second unit, if they go to more John Collins at the 5, to me that means you can't. I don't think you could play Dwight Howard because that's going to be a really tough matchup for him. I guess depending on game situation and all that too. But I think those are the two bigger adjustments I could see Nate McMillan making. Will they be enough? I'm not sure they will be, because I think the bottom line is what you talked about with Toronto series is that the Sixers really didn't have enough personnel to make another adjustment. Whereas the Sixers, I think, have enough personnel that they can make adjustments to whatever Atlanta is going to do.
First guy off the bench, who does Doc go to tonight? Does he go right back to the hot hand and say, Shake, let me see if you got it again? Or does he say true to his rotation? If he even has one.
Right. Well, it's been Matisse has been the first guy because for obvious reasons, just to show Trae Young a different look. I thought that was a really good. I thought the way Doc staggered in game 2 was significantly better than game 1. Granted, they still had the bench lineup that, did not work out very well, but I still thought he staggered a little better, keeping Joel and Ben on the floor together as much as humanly possible. But yeah, I mean, my guess would be those three guys we've already talked about as kind of being locks when you're talking about Thibault, Hill, and Dwight Howard. I don't expect that to change unless Atlanta goes more Collins at the 5. Then maybe you might see some adjustments. But yeah, I would think that the first crack's going to go to Shake Milton. I think you have to ride the hot hand and hope that maybe Shake has found his confidence a little bit here. Because quite frankly, Maxey and Korkmaz haven't been very, like in this series, as good as Maxey was in the first series, he really hasn't made an impact through 2 games. And Korkmaz, he's kind of in the place that Milton was, where he can't get anything to go right now. So I would imagine Doc's going to ride the hot hand, and Shake Milton is at the very least going to get the first crack at being that quote-unquote 9th guy.
It should be interesting. 7:30 tonight right here on 97.3 ESPN. A couple more with our Sixers insider, Paul Hudrick, at Paul Hudrick. Follow him for all the Sixers news. And obviously, they have had 2 days off here. I know Joel Embiid listed as questionable, but there's no indication or anything that would suggest he would not be the Joel Embiid we've seen over the first 2 games, where he's averaging 39.5 points per game.
I would think so. I mean, it's just, I guess with travel, I mean, this whole series, he might be listed as questionable in every single game.
That's right.
Just
like my father, by the way, my father's a big fan of yours. He loves listening to our segments. He says, man, that Hudrick guy is really good. I said, yeah, he's pretty good, man.
I appreciate that.
But he said, but is he going to be listed at question? Are we going to have to go through this the whole way? I said, yeah, but
yes.
Here's the thing. We know the Sixers. You know the Sixers better than most. They have been overly cautious with injuries over the year. So I can't imagine they're putting this guy at any risk by putting him out there with any thought that he can really seriously hurt himself. The way that they've handled injury, they didn't all of a sudden become the team that was overly cautious to reckless.
Yeah, I mean, it's a group. I'm sure it's a group thing, right? I mean, it probably goes all the way up to Daryl Morey, all the way down, to the athletic training staff and the sports science staff and everybody, the team doctors. Everybody probably has weighed in and kind of made a group decision. I'm sure Joel knows, what the possibilities are of what could happen. If God forbid, it worsens. I'm sure they're looking at it thoroughly. I'm sure he's getting examined every day as far as, if there's anything different or anything that he's feeling that's, atypical of what he's been feeling. But so far, so good. I mean, they're managing it very well. From what I understand, like the physical therapy, the idea is to strengthen the rest of the muscles around it so it stabilizes the knee better, so that, to your point, you're not risking any further injury. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're going to keep being careful, but of course there's going to be an element of risk, because you're talking about a meniscus tear and a 7 foot, 280 pound human that's playing professional basketball. So of course there's going to be some risk involved, but so far so good. They managed it very well. And to your point, I think if it took a turn south in any way, I think they would certainly reevaluate how they're managing everything.
A couple quickies on the other two. If I told you that Antetokounmpo was 14 of 31 and 1 for 8 from 3-point range, did they beat the Nets?
No, I mean, first of all, the fact that he took 8 threes, I would have assumed that they were down all game long for him to be jacking up that many threes. And this is where I've seen a lot of people discuss this on Twitter, and it's so like the Ben Simmons Giannis thing, because there are a lot of parallels to them and their skill sets. And I think if you could like somehow find a way for both of them to find a happy medium, like Giannis is sometimes can be too aggressive and take too many threes, in my opinion, and do some things out of his comfort zone that hurts the team. Whereas Ben Simmons sometimes doesn't do enough of that stuff. He's not aggressive enough sometimes and doesn't do enough stuff out of his comfort zone. So there's got to be like a happy medium for both of those guys. But yeah, if you had told me that, no. And I also, if you told me that the Milwaukee Bucks were going to not score 100 points and beat the Nets, I would have called you crazy. That was a super weird game, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
in game
and
4.
it's like, did Durant play a good game last night, or was he off? He scored 30 and had 11 rebounds, but at the end of the day, it was like he kind of didn't have a great game. Kind of, maybe. I don't know. Did he?
I would say the whole Nets team, actually.
Weird.
It seemed like they kind of all were off. Like, no one really had a particularly – I mean, Joe Harris missed a ton of shots.
1 for 7, Joe, from 3, 1 of 11 on the night.
Right. Yeah, and Bruce Brown lost his damn mind at one point. I mean, it was a weird game. And they just and quite that's kind of what's scary about the Brooklyn Nets is that really they didn't play well and they still had an absolute chance to win the game at the buzzer. So that's what's so scary about this team. But we'll see. I mean, in the playoffs, Mike, it does not matter how you win. If it's ugly, if it's pretty, if it's by 1, if it's by 20, it does not matter. So now the Milwaukee Bucks have protected home court, and we'll see what happens game 4.
Absolutely agree with that. Don't care how we win it. All right, Paul Hudrick, he's got you covered tonight for Sixers and the Hawks game 3. It's right here on 97.3 ESPN. The coverage begins at 7:30, and then it's Monday. Monday night, we do not have a game time. As soon as we get that, we'll pass that along to you. All right, Paul is back on Monday with a recap of game number 3 and a preview of game number 4. Thanks, man.
You got it, Mike. Take care, man.
All right, and he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.